Hello, I am Elizabeth Hobson, anti-feminist gender equality activist, and I'm joined by Mike Buchanan, founder and leader of Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. And we are joined for this International Conference on Men's Issues 2021 video by a very special guest, Anne Widdecombe. Mike and I have hosted a number of men's issues conferences, and no other guest has created such a buzz by appearing at our events as Anne has by appearing at this one. She's kindly agreed to a live Q&A after this video has been published during the conference, so stay tuned for that. Now, it would take too much time to do justice to Anne's life as an MP, cabinet minister, TV star, media personality and commentator, authoress, and so much more. So I suggest you check out her profile on the conference speakers list for more information. Anne, a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Sorry that we still have to discuss this issue.
Indeed. So my first question for you is referring to how you were elected to the House of Commons in 1987 under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and shared the House with a total of 27 other women. Of 650 MPs, that's just over 4%. When you left the House of Commons in 2010, women made up 20% of MPs. So, did you notice any difference in the character of the House or the quality of debate, or indeed the quality of governance that you attribute to the increase in women's representation?
No, absolutely not. I have always held to the view that every woman in the House of Commons has got the right to look every man from the Prime Minister downwards in the eye and to know that she got there on exactly the same basis as he got there. And if she can't do that, then she becomes a second-class citizen. Now, when I was trying to get into Parliament, I had to compete on exactly the same basis as the men. There were no quotas, there were no all-women shortlists, there were no A-lists, there was no artificial help at all. And so when I got in there, I knew that I'd got in there on exactly the same merits as any man. But if you go in looking for discrimination, you'll find it. And I vividly remember about 6 months after all the Blair babes got in, just to refresh people's memory, the Blair babes, 101 of them, 101 new women came into Parliament. You might as well have had 101 Dalmatians, quite honestly. But they came in under all these all-women shortlists and quota rules and all the rest of it, 101 of them. And about 6 months afterwards, one of them came up to me in a corridor and she said to me, Anne, isn't it horrible how the men are so rude to us? And I said, yes. And isn't it horrible how they're so rude to each other? And she hadn't thought of that. She'd just been roughed up in the chamber. She assumed it was because she was a woman. In fact, it was because she was useless.
Absolutely. It reminds me of the scandal that happened when Jeremy Corbyn quite blatantly, as he was sitting down during Prime Minister's question time with Theresa May, muttered, "Bloody woman." And everybody went nuts, and it just bewildered me because I thought, had he have said "bloody man," not an eyebrow would have been raised. And had he said "wonderful woman," that would have been okay too. So it's a strange, and I wonder whether the culture in the house might have changed a bit, whether there's more eggshells to walk on.
The culture in the house has undeniably changed, but it's changed with the social culture in general. People are now, worshipping at the cult of victimhood, looking for offence, looking for triggers, reading things into every single thing that is said, reading something wrong into what is being said. Whereas, the sort of feminism that I espoused in the 70s, and I often shock younger relatives by pointing out to them that when I was graduating from Oxford, it was perfectly lawful, and I do mean perfectly lawful, for an employer to advertise a job with two rates of pay underneath it, one for a man and one for a woman. That was lawful. It was lawful to refuse a woman finance without her husband's signature. It was lawful to refuse a woman a job simply because she was a woman. And I point all this out, and I say I was a 70s feminist. But what we wanted was equality of opportunity. We wanted to be able to do those jobs at the same rate of pay. What we never asked for, which is what began to happen in the 90s when feminism took a completely wrong turn. What we never asked for was we just wanted a level playing field. We never asked for it to be tilted towards us. We never asked for special favors. We always said, just give us the chance. We'll show you we're as good as, if not better than the men. And now women are going on all the time. I remember in the 70s, people said, oh, well, you know, women in the workplace, the menopause, etc. And we said, rot. And now you've got women in the workplace and, oh, you know, I want special treatment because I'm going through the menopause or whatever. I mean, honestly.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it?
I should perhaps say at this point that I've been asked a few times in interviews, Anne, who my all-time British political hero is, and I say every time Margaret Thatcher. She was head and shoulders above any prime minister in my lifetime, and probably going back a century, possibly excluding Churchill.
Churchill, I was going to say, yeah. If you ask me for my favourite politician, certainly Thatcher would be among them. But I would quote Churchill, but that's not unexpected. But the other person I always quote is Wilberforce, for exactly the same reason that I quote Churchill, because I say, look, they both started out with very unpopular positions. You know, Churchill was against appeasement at a time when the whole nation was war weary. It was only 20 years since the end of the last war. The whole nation was war weary, didn't really want to fight again. Churchill understood it had to. Similarly, Wilberforce, nobody was very interested in slavery. His big problem wasn't the economic interests that were against him. His real problem was just public indifference. Nobody really caught on to how important the moral issues surrounding slavery were. And both those two men, just despite the fact that what they were doing wasn't popular, just kept going, as did Margaret Thatcher. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're popular or not. What actually matters is whether what you're doing is the right thing.
And she got so many votes from men, you know, men on the left as well, that recognized a true leader. Okay, my first question, Anne. Professor Janice Fiamengo is a Canadian anti-feminist and men's rights advocate, and probably the highest profile woman in the men's rights movement. She's the keynote speaker at this conference. In a recent email exchange, that she agreed I could draw from for this interview, she wrote this: "It is hard to believe that a movement so avowedly vicious as feminism has been allowed to take over every major institution in every Western country." End of quote. Since at least the time David Cameron was elected party leader in 2005, the Conservative Party has done nothing to challenge feminists, and all too often has adopted policy positions even the Labour Party would be reluctant to adopt, such as increasing the proportion of women on corporate boards, despite knowing about the causal link with corporate financial decline. I presented the evidence for that causal link to a House of Commons inquiry in 2012. Do you have any explanations for the party's craven surrender to feminist ideology? And are you encouraged by growing signs of opposition to feminism and feminists from a number of Conservative MPs, including those at this conference?
Well, first of all, let me just say there that I'm all for women on boards, providing they get their own merit.
Well, that's the issue.
I know women. I mean, look at the Dragon's Den. You know, I mean, I know women who are superb at business and superb at managing big companies. And it would be quite wrong to say, you know, that there is necessarily a link between the number on the board and the decline of the business. What I think there is a direct connection to is whether or not women are there for merit, or whether they're there because it is necessary to fill a quota for a sort of PR job. And that is what I think has gripped the Conservative Party, its public relations. Instead of thinking what actually matters is that people who come into the House of Commons are meritorious, whether they're male, female, gay, straight, young, old, black, white, doesn't matter, just as long as they're individually meritorious. And therefore, if they think they don't have enough women or they don't have enough of something else, go out and find people of merit, but don't bill special favours. I actually saw this at work. When I was leaving Maidstone, I was naturally involved in the selection for my successor. And we reached a point where the selection committee had decided that we wanted 3 men. We wanted 3 men and 1 woman on the shortlist. Now the woman was streets ahead, as it happened, but behind her came 3 men. The central office agent said, you can't do that. You've got to have 2 men and 2 women. And we said, well, hang on, there's actually still quite a lot of men between that one and the next woman. And he said, no. And I actually said to the central office agent, I said to him in terms, I said, are you telling us we cannot select on merit? And he was extremely honest. He said, yes, I'm afraid so. Now, that to my mind is a way to reduce the quality of Parliament. Also, there's the whole issue of equality and fairness. If you reserve a constituency for an all-woman shortlist, then you are saying, by definition, no man need apply for this seat because we're going to have an all-woman shortlist. So if you've got a man who's grown up in that constituency, sent his children to school there, used its health services, knows it like the back of his hand, he can't even put his hat in the ring because that seat is reserved for a woman. Now, that isn't what the Conservative Party does. It is what the Labour Party initiated. But I just think that you have to allow women of ability to compete on exactly the same level as the men, and they will come through. They will come through. Margaret Thatcher came through with no special favours. Look on the other side of the house, Shirley Williams, Barbara Castle, wherever you look, you can see women who have got there on their own merits, and they're the best. And that applies to boards as well. Now, why is the Conservative Party so craven in the face of all of this? Because it's playing the same game. It's PR. It wants to show lots of women in the cabinet, lots of women on the front bench. It wants to do that. And sometimes you get very meritorious women. But if all you're looking for is the fact that they're women rather than meritorious, you're also going to get the other sort as well.
You're also going to get Jess Phillips. I've tried to draw Philip Davis on the issue of Jess Phillips, and he won't. Sadly, he won't give me a good soundbite.
I don't know that I can give you a particularly good one either.
Okay, I recall Vince Cable, then Lib Dem leader, saying very proudly to a select committee that the Lib Dem party had a rule of having all women shortlists for winnable seats, and one can only imagine that they had all men shortlists for unwinnable seats.
Exactly. That says it all. That says it all. And that, I think, sometimes people don't turn it round. As I say, if you say, you're discriminating in favour of women by having an all-woman shortlist, you are saying at the same time that you're discriminating against men. And the same thing goes for boards. Once you have quotas, you're saying, well, it doesn't matter if a man is more meritorious. We have to fill the quota. And all these things are against the spirit of feminism in the 70s. I'm not anti-feminist. I'm a 70s feminist. I stick by that. I just want to compete equally with the men. I don't want any special favours, and I don't want things tilted towards me. But we are now moving into a period of our social history when it's actually positively disadvantageous to be a man.
Mm-hmm. Just a very quick aside on the women on boards issue, and because I run a website called Campaign for Merit in Business, and in 2010, one of the first actions of the new coalition government was to appoint Lord Davis of Abersock, a Labour peer, to write a report on how, not whether, to increase the proportion of women on corporate boards, which reported a year later. In the executive summary, I think it's the start of the second paragraph, there's a line that says something like, there's considerable evidence to show that increasing the proportion of women on corporate boards leads to enhanced financial performance. And there was a number 1 for the reference, a footnote at the bottom of the page. And at the bottom of the page, sure enough, there was a number 1, a blank space next to it. They couldn't even be bothered and it's still up there. But of course, the media never expose these lies. But anyway, I've talked enough.
Shall we move on to the next question in the interest of time?
Yes, please.
So, in 1967, The Abortion Act, sponsored by David Steel of the Liberal Party, became law, legalising abortion under certain conditions. You yourself introduced a pro-life bill in the late 80s and once wrote that we could always be proud of the fact that there was a vast difference between Labour and Conservatives on matters of conscience on pro-life issues. Now, there appears to me to be an irony that the Conservative Party, who are presented as ruthless individualists, are so much more active in the protection of the most vulnerable members of our society, whereas the Labour Party and wider left, who are supposed to be in support of vulnerable people, consistently seem to push for the liberalisation of abortion. So how do you explain this phenomenon?
Well, I think it's fairly straightforward. I think that Labour see this as part of women's rights, and some in the Conservative Party do as well. But many in the Conservative Party do not. They think it is a matter of the right of the child. And after all, that child has no voice except Parliament. It has no voice. It cannot say whether it lives or dies. I mean, it has always been the case that Labour tend to take what you might call the socially liberal line. But I think it's a very odd position for Labour women to say that it's all about women's rights, when by definition, 50% of the children aborted will be girls, by definition.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to add. I'd just like to add to that, Anne. The number one list. I mean, for a few years now, the number one list of men's and boys' issues that we have next to me is abortion. And of course, it does affect girls, of course, as well as boys, as does fetal alcohol syndrome and fatherlessness. But I just like to touch on something that's just occurred to me. There was, of course, a huge lie at the very heart of the 1967 Abortion Act, which was that abortions were, how do I put this, were permissible on the grounds of protecting the mother's mental health. Now, I'm not aware 54 years on, of a single piece of evidence from anywhere in the world showing that it has that protective value. On the contrary, if anything, it is damaging to women's health, and how could it not be? And in the meantime, we've had I can only term a Holocaust: 10 million unborn children killed in that period. It is. I hope that future generations will look back on this and look with utter disbelief and shame that this was possible.
Oh, I think they will, and indeed I said as much when the 1990 the Government Act went through, and we had for the very first time in this country abortion up to birth. And I said I believe that future generations would look back in disbelief at what we had done. But I think the single biggest lie that was told at the time of the Abortion Act, and I actually believe it was told in good faith, was that this wasn't going to lead to abortion on demand. There were very strict provisions in law. You had to have two doctors. They had to have examined the woman, blah, 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 blah. And of course, we know that all went out of the window, and the practice of the law and its theory became two completely different things. One of the reasons why I'm so against assisted suicide is because of what happened with the Abortion Act. I mean, it just became, without any change in the law at all until 1990, it just became a very, very different scenario from the one that Parliament had presented to it. And so it's become a complete runaway bus. And to me, that is the major concern. When I was on the Health Select Committee, we examined the workings of the conscience clause in the Abortion Act. That is the clause which allows doctors and nurses and gynecologists to say they won't actually handle abortions. And we interviewed a gynecologist a consultant who had gone to Australia and had subsequently come back. And she said the difference she noticed was that when she went to Australia, which I think, if I get it right, was sometime in the early 70s, but when she went to Australia, if you wanted to carry out an abortion, you had to explain why. By the time she came back from Australia, which was in the 80s, if you wanted not to carry out an abortion, you had to explain why. That was how the culture had changed in that period. And I always think that is the best illustration that I received in the whole of that examination, of how culture moves, you know.
Yes.
And I mean, I always quote as an aside, but just to explain the huge influence that culture has, I look at the Sunday trading laws. Scotland had no Sunday trading laws, but it was one of the most Sabbatarian societies going.
Yes.
We had Sunday trading laws, and we traded like that on a Sunday long before there was any change in the law. Culture was the determining factor.
Yeah, and on that note, I think, and also with reference to how the left and pro-abortionists portray the issue as about women's autonomy, I don't see their activities as promoting women's autonomy, and I'm thinking in particular about what happened in Ealing, which was that there was a pro-life group who were protesting outside of an abortion clinic, which involved holding prayer vigils and handing out leaflets which detailed the financial support, therapy support, and housing support that they would give to women who would choose not to kill their babies. And the local Ealing Council enforced a public space protection order to prevent that group from being anywhere near the abortion clinic. And I don't see the link between encouraging women to be autonomous, to make informed decisions, and treating them like adults.
Well, we all know that the abortion providers put huge stress on abortion and aren't really interested if a woman wants a different sort of solution. Just as we also know that some of the big pro-life groups, like Life, for example, actually offer alternatives to women who decide they don't really want an abortion. They will give them accommodation, you know, they will look after them. And I used to have a Life house in my constituency when I was the MP for Maidstone, and it celebrated its 21st anniversary. And not only were the mums present, but some of their children, who were then mums themselves, came along. So it was very rewarding to see this is what can happen if you offer people alternatives, and they're free to choose. They should be free to choose whichever way they want under the law. Obviously, I always hope they'll choose one way, but you know, the law enables them to choose another. But the idea that you cut off one of the options, which is to go ahead and have the baby, that you actually cut that off, is wrong. The other thing is, and since we're talking about men's issues, of course, men have no say in whether their child is going to be aborted or not. And I think that one of the most wonderful stories of the last few decades is that of the Oxford student, as he was called, because he's anonymous. And an Oxford student got his girlfriend pregnant, and she wanted an abortion, and he opposed it, and he actually went to court. Well, needless to say, he lost. But the girlfriend was so impressed with the extent to which he was prepared to take that fight that she said, okay, I will have the baby, but you, the man, you bring it up, not I, you. And he said, okay, and he did. And that young lady was at a pro-life rally a few years ago.
That's a wonderful
story. Now
story.
Fully fledged adult. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you were asked on GB News recently to suggest what they should have a debate about.
Yes.
And rather magnificently, you suggested men's rights.
That's right.
Instead, they had a debate on transphobia. Like you know, we really haven't had enough of those, have we? Now, we haven't been surprised that the channel hasn't challenged feminism or feminists. Indeed, one of their presenters, Gloria De Piero, was a Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. The chairman of GB News is Andrew Neil, who is also the chairman of the Spectator magazine. The magazine refused to accept our full-page advert relating some long-known truths about domestic violence, but has been happy to print articles with feminist lies about the issue. The articles include more than 50 from Julie Bindel, a radical feminist who has made a career out of lying about domestic violence. The mainstream media feed the public a constant stream of feminist narratives, all of which are one or more of 5 things: baseless conspiracy theories, fantasies, lies, delusions, or myths. The same media very rarely publish the truth about men's issues and feminist claims. What do you think explains this stark reality? And do you have any expectations that it might change in the foreseeable future?
Well, look, first of all, I don't want to minimise domestic violence because I do believe that it exists. And I believe that largely, certainly not exclusively, we know some men are the victims of it, but largely it is women who are the victims. And I do admire Erin Pissy, who said, no, you let me finish, young man. And I do admire Erin Pitsey, who set up the refuges to start with when there was no state provision, in much the same way that the hospice movement started as a private initiative. I much admire her for that. Now, I think one of the problems is domestic violence is serious. I think one of the problems is it's now being defined and redefined and redefined. I just wonder at the moment if sometimes we don't hear the other side. And also, domestic violence can very easily be cited as a means to prevent access when perhaps none has taken place. But I'm not going to underestimate domestic violence because some things go on behind closed doors that are really very nasty.
Okay, if I may reply to that, Anne. You have somewhere a copy of William Collins's book, The Empathy Gap. He has a considerable amount of information on it. One of the pieces of information I'd point you to is the largest ever review of the academic literature on domestic violence is called the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project 2013. One of its conclusions was that, and I'll confine myself to mixed sex couples here, although the women are far more likely to be abused by a female partner than a male partner, but let's leave that to one side. In about 60% of mixed sex couples, heterosexual couples, where there is violence, it is mutual. Sometimes the man starts it, sometimes the woman. In the 40% that remains, it is twice as likely that the perpetrator is the woman as the man. These are, and this has been known for decades, Anne, and yet the public perception is the complete opposite. And every time we see in the media an article about domestic violence, there'll be a cowering woman and a man with a bat or a hammer or a clenched fist. It's nonsense. I mean, women are as violent towards men as men are towards women.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you because I do not have those statistics. But what I do know is that where you've got serious domestic violence, I'm not talking about shoving and pushing, but where you've got serious domestic violence, where people are very badly injured and end up in hospital, it's nearly always the woman. But anyway, okay, I will defer to your statistics.
Okay. No, I defer. William Collins is considered, I think you'll agree with this, Elizabeth, the absolute authority when it comes to factual data on gender issues.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Is gold standard of analysis. We're very lucky to have him. Anne.
Yes.
You recollected meeting too many men who were being denied access to their children, usually by scheming ex-wives or ex-partners who wanted to include the children in the concept of a clean break.
Yeah.
I imagine that all MPs must have similar experiences. So why do you think it is that the children in particular are still being denied justice in this critical area? Do you foresee any progress? And who will lead that push for progress if it is to happen?
I don't see very much progress, quite honestly. This is something that I raised, quite a lot when I was in Parliament, particularly informally, in conversations in the tea room or at the lunch table or whatever, and said, look, really women are getting away with an awful lot. And of course, I always get the standard reply, which is the law says the child's interests are paramount. Now, that is obvious. The child's interests are indeed paramount. But it is too easy for a woman who wants to, and let me also say right away, there are thousands and thousands of women who divorce quite amicably, who let their husbands or their partners see their kids, and there isn't a problem. But where there is a problem, it's all too easy for the woman to frustrate a court order. And indeed, I wrote an entire novel about just such a situation. It was called Father Figure, by the way. Thank you. So I'm just going to have a very quick swig. I'm afraid I've got, if not the lurgy, I've got something or other. So it's easy for a woman to frustrate a court order. So the court order says, you know, the man must see the child every weekend or whatever it is. And it's very, very easy to frustrate that. Considering that the overwhelming majority of access orders are made with the woman having the, you know, the majority, being the resident parent. Considering that you know, that is the norm, the courts really should take a much tougher attitude towards women who take advantage of that. Now, I don't have a problem in normal breakup with the woman having the children, because I think most children do actually want their mother. But where a woman either alienates the children from the father or frustrates the father from seeing them, or just uses endless devices to try and get out of an access arrangement, where that happens, I think the courts should intervene, and they don't, or they rarely do.
Well, one imagines if the standard thing was, you know, a week in prison, it might focus their minds in future.
I wouldn't actually do a week in prison. I would do something that was proposed but somehow faded away. I would say, right, here is an access weekend. If the woman is frustrating the access, then while the husband has charge of the children, the woman should be doing unpaid work or something. You know, there are ways of doing it. And I would say exactly the same in reverse if it was a man frustrating access. Children need both parents, and unless the parent is genuinely violent, children need both parents.
And it was wonderful to see Philip Davies get in the guidance notes of the latest domestic abuse bill, that parental alienation is itself a form of domestic abuse.
Abuse, it is.
You know, against huge opposition from feminist MPs, it need hardly be said.
No, it is. It really is a form of abuse. Denying a child a father is totally reprehensible. It is abuse.
I believe you dedicated that book to your father, didn't you?
I dedicated that book to my brother.
Ah, right. Beg your pardon.
As I said, you know, a terrific father. Yeah.
Right. And you'll recall the WASPI campaign. Women. That's kind of the face that we pull when we hear it as well. The Women Against State Pension Inequality, in connection with a date being set after which women would start to receive their state pensions at the same age as men. Women had at one time started receiving their state pensions at the age of 60, 5 years earlier than men, despite men dying at an earlier age than women. Only in a world hell-bent on privileging women could the loss of a privilege be presented as an inequality by the campaign. Now, I recall a memorable TV program in which you had a discussion in the home of a woman working for the campaign, the WASPI campaign, and you expressed utter bewilderment at her claim that she, along with other women, hadn't received sufficient notification of the change. And you even stated the number of letters sent out to affected women by the government. It was something like, I've probably got the figure wrong, but it's something like, we sent out 2 million letters.
I think it was 5 million.
Was it 5 million?
I think,
okay. How would you explain the conviction of so many women that they hadn't been informed of the change?
Well, I think this is actually quite a serious question. There were two issues with the WASPI campaign. There were the women who said they simply didn't know, they hadn't had time to make preparation. And there was the campaign that ran alongside it, which was back to 60, you know, take the pension age back to 60. Now, I had no time at all for that second campaign, for going back to 60. Absolutely lunatic. At a time when, you know, the rest of the world is actually upping its state pension age because of longevity. And it was a nonsense. But alongside that was the WASPI campaign, which was very specifically focused on not having notice. Now, in fact, I was the pensions minister who began it a long time ago in the early 90s. And I had a public consultation and I got thousands of letters in from women at the time. And I also consulted all the major organisations, who in turn would have consulted all their members. Then there were several changes along the way, and each and every change got a huge amount of publicity until in the end, a long time later, because this was a very long drawn out process, when the Labour government raised, and by the way, Conservatives, Coalition and Labour all raised the state pension age. And when the Labour government made its move, it sent out something like 5 million letters. So most people would have known. However, I did notice one or two things from the letters I got following that programme. Most of the people who said that they didn't know were people who were self-employed, or they had worked for so long and then they'd taken a child break or whatever it was. They weren't the people in the big companies where quite obviously the personnel departments made sure that everybody knew. So I am prepared to admit that there may be a few women who didn't know, but the fact is it was terribly widely publicised. And as I point out, you don't write individually to everybody every time the income tax rate goes up.
No. I'm reminded of the feminist narratives about the gender pension gap. The gender pension gap is 100% attributable to the fact that women put less money into their pensions than men.
Yes, I mean, one of the big problems is, of course, because this goes back generations, so you're paying pensions now to people who were working in very different social environments. And there is a group of pensioners, a whole cohort of pensioners, who stopped work to bring up children because that was what was then expected. It was just the social norm. And that is what they did. So quite inevitably, they have put in less than the men. And it was also the case that because women could retire at 60 for so long and the men had to work for 65, that quite inevitably, once again, they put in over less of a working lifetime. So the gender gap is explicable by various things. And I would say that it was grossly unfair that for all those years, men worked 5 years longer and lived 5 years shorter.
I just like, we have a little time left. I don't know if you have another question, Elizabeth, but one I'd like to ask is that, well, about two women really. Margaret Thatcher,
yes,
qualified as a barrister, so she was entitled to use the designation QC, but I don't think she ever practiced, and she never used the thing. Harriet Harman, I think she was Solicitor General, and so she was entitled to use the QC purely as a matter of, I think, tradition or something, and did so. I wonder if you have any thoughts on Harriet Harman.
Well, of course, using the title QC, you don't just become a QC because you qualify at the bar, as you probably know. It's when you take silk, when you've been at the bar for some years. So I think that's probably why Mrs. Thatcher didn't use QC. I don't really have a view. If people want to parade their qualifications, let them parade their qualifications. As far as I'm concerned, Harriet Harman has, in the long term, done the women's cause no good at all, because it is all a railing against men. I still remember her when I was on a committee of a health bill in the mid 80s, late 80s. I was on a committee, and Harriet Harman said, and this was what she actually claimed, that women should be on the boards of hospital trusts because they understood things like getting a double buggy through a door. And I said, and it's there in Hansard, I said, is this really?
Oh, you frozen.
This is really the basis on which we want to appoint women. Don't talk about men in that way, about such trivia. You talk about men as being competent, as being professional, as having knowledge of business, as being able to manage a trust. What have double buggies going through doors got to do with the price of fish?
Extraordinary. I mean, Harriet Harman or Vera Baird, who would you say is the more evil?
Sorry, Harriet or?
Harriet Harman or Vera Baird, who would you describe as the more evil?
Well, I wouldn't use evil. I'm a Christian. I don't call anybody evil. That is going down a very dangerous route. I certainly wouldn't call anybody evil. If you mean whom do I find the more tiresome, which is a very different question altogether, I think Vera.
Yes, she some of the things she said of late, yes. There's actually a judicial challenge underway about some of the nonsense that she spouted. She's never cared about a male victim as victims commissioner, so far as I can see. Anyway, Elizabeth, is there anything more you want to ask?
Well, there's something I want to say.
Yes, please, Anne.
Why are you men so darn feeble? Why are you so feeble? When we were the downtrodden sex, and we were for many years.
No, you were not. No, you were not, Anne, but please carry on.
Yeah, we were for many, many
Yep.
years, as I've already explained the situation I faced in the 70s about employment. When we were the downtrodden sex, we fought. We said, right, enough of this. We want equality. We want this. We want that. And we got it. Now it's gone too far, but we got it. Why are you so feeble?
You got it, Anne. Well, for a start, I mean, there are some exceptions, but women benefit hugely and have historically from gynocentrism, the concern, you know, to give them what they want. There is not, across the developed world at least, such a thing as androcentrism. So Anne, I have a list here.
On Father's Day.
So I have a list here next to me of 25 areas where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the actions and inactions of the state. I defy you to tell me one area in Britain today where the human rights of women and girls specifically are assaulted. There are none. So, but the question is, why don't men fight?
You've just used a very important word you said today, and I agree. That's why I said to you, it's now gone too far. But there was a time when women were at a specific disadvantage in the employment market, in the financial markets, in getting into Parliament. We were at a specific disadvantage. And as far as I'm concerned, we fought like tigers to put that right. Why don't you fight like tigers?
Can I?
And
You come on, like
sorry, Elizabeth.
I would like to point out at this point that it was women and men who fought to fight women's disadvantages. And so when you were talking earlier about your favourite politicians, well, mine would have to be, if I could only have one, it would be John Stuart Mill, who was elected on a platform including votes for women in Islington, and obviously wrote The Subjection of Women, and campaigned so tirelessly and eloquently for women to have political representation. And you had Millicent Fawcett was supported by her husband Henry, financially, morally, and I think that if you look very clear-eyed at women's battles for women's disadvantages, against women's disadvantages, you will find that there have been men and women standing shoulder to shoulder. And
same difference, because the fact is the men wouldn't have had to stand shoulder to shoulder with us if we hadn't had something that we wanted. Now there's something that you want. And what I'm saying to the men, I say it everywhere I go, I say, don't be so feeble, start fighting back. Start fighting back. The women in the House of Commons, why aren't they fighting back?
And I have to say, until recently, Philip Davis MP was the only elected politician in the English-speaking world prepared to stand up for the human rights of men and boys. So we can take. I can go. I mean, we could spend 2 hours on this, Anne. If you take. Sorry, Elizabeth. Just want to finish this. If you take suicide rate, the male suicide rate in the UK is 3.5 times that of women. It triples after divorce, because primarily because fathers are denied access to their children. Where are the? I mean, how is a man in that position, Anne? He will be destroyed in the family courts. He'll be bankrupted. I know men who've spent £400,000 and still cannot see their children. Yeah. Men are fighting, but they're destroyed when they fight.
I think the problem is there is a difference between fighting individually and fighting as a group. Now, what the women did was, yes, there were lots of individual fights going on, but they weren't going to make any difference. What actually made a difference was the huge social pressure that was generated by a group. And I just think, no, I really do mean this. Don't just sit back and say there is nothing we can do.
No, and I'm not saying that. What I'm asking you to try and understand is that politicians will bend to the collective will of women. You know, all these disadvantages that men face, they're almost all the results of women privileges. And politicians are not interested in removing male disadvantage. They're only interested in increasing female privilege. And you talked about the PR, the Conservatives with you know, their PR issue. You know, every party chases the women. Sorry, Elizabeth.
I think it's not appropriate to conflate women with feminists in the presence of myself and Anne. I think that I don't think it's women's collective will. Go on.
It's a type of feminism. As I say, I was a 70s feminist, but I'm just not never was a 90s feminist. The whole thing changed its meaning then, changed its meaning completely.
Yeah, I think that there is a problem though with feminist gatekeeping, which relates to what Mike was talking about earlier when he wanted to present the other side of the domestic violence story in The Spectator. And even though they've presented the feminist narrative over and over again, they refused to provide their readers with some balance.
What was their reason? Did they dispute this?
They didn't give one, Anne, because they didn't need to. They are not held accountable. It's like the BBC, you know, is relentless feminist narratives, never any men's issues sort of narrative. But I mean, I think it's part of the Home Office, the Family Justice Panel. It's one of these left-wing things, you know, you always got to, you know, 11 people on that panel. Every one of them are feminist, including a High Court judge. Now, only 7% of British women self-identify as feminists, and yet they control every pinch point in government, the civil service, you name it. And why can't men fight collectively? Because they you know, I mean, how could they? I mean, they are.
Quite honestly, you collude in it. You collude in it.
Oh, terribly.
Well, I certainly don't, Anne.
They're the majority of family court judges.
I know you don't, and I don't, and Fathers for Justice don't. But the men collude in it. Look at the imbalance between men and women in the House of Commons, but the men collude in unfairness.
Oh, no, Anne, you're right. Those men do. Those men do, but men, you know, the average.
So do men who are interviewing for positions, you know, and then they fill in all the diversity forms and all the rest of it. You know, and told that, you know, women must be represented. I mean, for heaven's sake, you all collude. From where I sit, you're but you collectively are.
No, Anne, we're not. Anne, you're making the mistake of looking at men as, you know, it is a tiny number of men. Let's say in Parliament, there's what, 400 men, I guess, roughly, something like that. This is a tiny group of men who will not say no to women. It is not the 30 million men in the country that fold over. It is the 400 men in Parliament in the main.
No, I'm sorry, that's nonsense, because the number of men whom I've heard say, oh, but I can't say that these days, or something of that sort. And I say, why don't you jolly say it?
Because,
you know, you've got to the point where a man can't even say to a woman, oh, that's a nice dress. I mean, what sort of world are we living in? A woman who's wearing a nice dress wants to be told she's wearing a nice dress. That's why she's wearing the nice dress. Oh,
unless she's Harriet Bloody Harman, probably.
even if she's a, you know, radical victimhood feminist, she secretly wants to be told she's got a nice dress so she can have a tantrum.
I'd like to see someone tell Vera Baird she's looking nice just to see her head explode.
Oh.
And no, I'd love to say, any chance of a smile, Vera? That would go down well, I imagine. Anyway. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to...
Are you winding up, Elizabeth?
Do the outro?
Certainly. Well, thank you so much, Anne, for talking to us. And thank you so much for that question at the end that provoked a very spirited debate. And I think that it's hopefully going to inspire some questions from the audience in the live Q&A afterwards. Maybe they have some answers. I think that you are onto something. I think we do need to empower men to fight for their rights. So thank you again, Anne. Love talking to you.
Thank you, Anne. It's been a great pleasure.